For years I have dabbled in the knitting arts. Well, art. I only knit. So I thought this DIY project would be a great chance for me to try out that other knitting art form, crochet. The book I used is Crocheting for Fun by Lisa Bullard. I found it in the nonfiction section of my local library. In fact, this was the only crocheting book available. There is no age range specified on this item, but from my own perusal and a look at reviews, including School Library Journal, I would put the age range for this book at 3rd through 5th grade. The language is relatively simple, as are the instructions. A good 2nd grade reader may be able to read the words, but I think following this many step-by-step directions from a book might be a little advanced at this age without adult guidance. I would cap it at 5th grade because this is a very basic introduction to knitting, and I think 6th graders would grasp it quickly enough to want more information immediately. So what's in this introduction to crocheting? There is a surprising amount of history, including sections on people, places, and fun around the world, crocheting for a cause, a timeline, trivia, and fashion. At times, it seems to be trying a little too hard to make crocheting cool. And some of the fashion references are already out of date. I doubt today's 3rd graders know or care who Martha Stewart is. The book is from 2009, and we can hardly blame any work for its fashions being out of date, seeing as how they change every season. I do think that the sections on the history of the craft are very informative. However, this lifesaver information about the Great Potato Famine may not resonate with kids who have never studied this period in history. I would have liked to see a little bit more background on the history to get kids up to speed and a little more emphasis on how it is affecting people all over the world today. But I'm a nut for that kind of stuff. Maybe kids are more interested in the fashion. They probably are. This is the danger of adults reviewing children's materials. But onward to the project! It starts with talking about the materials you will need, beginning with yarn. All it really says is that there are lots of different types of yarn, and your pattern will tell you what you need. You can then look at the label to figure out what kind of yarn you are holding. It does not introduce common terms for the weight of yarn, such as worsted, which is used later in this book in its own patterns. It also doesn't show any examples of yarn labels to point out how to read them. They can be confusing. There are lots of symbols and abbreviations. An example would have been really helpful. It then shows the materials you will need: crochet hooks, tapestry needle, scissors, and a ruler. It explains what the unfamiliar ones are and why you need each item. This is the spread for tying a slip knot to begin your project. I had a hard time deciphering these pictures, but then again, I'm useless at knots. The written instructions were very helpful, though. This was perhaps the most frustrating part of the whole learning process. It basically says, hold your hook however you want. It also only gives one example of how to hold the yarn. I was awful at it. I had to improvise my own variation. It does say that lots of people have their own way of holding yarn, but I think that more examples or more pictures of the process of holding the yarn this way would have been helpful. So, now that we have our materials and we know how to hold them, we can start. The beginning is making a foundation chain, and there are 3 steps to this, and they're very clear. You need to wrap the yarn around the hook from back to front. Got it. Then turn the hook away from you and pull it through the loop you already have on the hook. I could not for the life of me accomplish this. I kept hooking the loop. I ended up improvising again and turning the hook downward so that it would go through the gap in the loop. If I had been very keen on following all the directions to a T, I would not have made it past this step. There are no instructions on what to do if you have a hard time with this. My attempt. My stitches are not very even, and I think I may have messed up somewhere down there, but it's a good first attempt. Now we can do real crochet stitches. This involves hooking one of the loops on the chain so that you have 2 loops on your hook, then wrapping the yarn around the hook, pulling it through the first loop on the hook, and then wrapping the yarn around the hook again and pulling it through both loops on the hook this time. I was able to do this! Yay! Here's my example. I made a new foundation chain to do this because the new one was a little bit better. Hey, I'm already getting better. That's pretty good for me. This picture is what it's supposed to look like. So I persisted and added another row. And here's that. The next page explains how to add more colors. It is simply a matter of using a new ball of yarn as your working yarn in the next row. Here's my attempt. It's a little ugly, but that's okay. I accomplished my task. Finishing a project is easy. Just snip the ends and use your tapestry needle to weave them into the edges of the project. This is the same as knitting. I think the directions were pretty clear here, and the pictures were very helpful too. Now we're ready to start thinking about a real pattern, but first we need to determine our gauge. According to the book, we need to crochet a 4-inch square and count the stitches in rows. So an example would be having 18 stitches to make 4 inches and 8 rows to make 4 inches. This can be affected by the size of your yarn, the size of your needle, and the size of the stitches that you make. The book basically says to play around with the size of your needles to get the right gauge, not to try to change the size of your stitches. But this didn't work for me. I went from a size G to a size E. US sizes go down the alphabet from A, with A being the smallest. So it was a significant size difference in the needles, but my gauge didn't change much. I ended up having to try to stitch smaller. The book then gives several patterns. Here's a dishcloth, a striped scarf, a pretty purse, and an afghan section. The book explains that an afghan is a blanket made up of several of these small rectangles of yarn. I decided to try to do an afghan section. I figured that if it was any good, I could keep going and make more and finally have a Christmas present for my friends. I did wish there was a picture of a completed afghan, though, so that I would have an idea what kind of colors and patterns were common. Oh well. I did as the book said, and it worked pretty well. The most frustrating part is that I kept sticking my needle through the middle of a piece of yarn. That was tricky to fix, but I persisted. Eventually, I noticed it looked like I was losing stitches. My rows were getting shorter the further I went. See? I looked through the book for answers to how this happened or how to fix it, and only found this, quote, "It is easy to accidentally add or subtract stitches when you are first learning to crochet. One way to know if you are doing this is to count your stitches every few rows." Unquote. But I had already forgotten how many stitches I started with. Also, this didn't tell me how to fix the problem once it started. So I just pushed forward. Eventually, I decided I wasn't going to persist in making this piece an afghan piece. It wasn't the right shape, so I stopped a little early. It's more of a square, well, trapezoid, than a rectangle. Also, I don't know why the edges aren't flat. There's nothing in the book about that. I suspect it has something to do with why my piece kept getting smaller. Luckily, the book has a Where to Learn More section. Hopefully these resources, or YouTube videos, will help with my questions. I was able to tie off the project and weave in the ends. I never feel secure that the ends will stay in with just weaving, so I ended up tying them. You can kind of see that. Oh well. The book also has a glossary and an index at the end to help define and find some things throughout the book. All in all, I don't think this is a bad introduction to knitting. I like the historical and cultural information. I like that the directions are clear and simple. I wish there was more illustrative pictures throughout, and I wish there was more information about how to fix common mistakes. I do plan on trying again, but I will use a different resource as my guide, now that I've learned the basic stitches from this book.